guys, welcome to BFS Wargaming. So we're going to do a little chat with the current LGT champion, Tiny Chu.
2 years running because it didn't run this year. Yeah.
So yeah, he gets the 2020 automatically.
That's the one. That's what we're going with. Keeping the plaque. So there we go.
So we are going to talk about 9th edition. We're going to talk about some of Tony's views, my views. Obviously, we're more interested in Tony's views, but I'll just chip in every now and again with what I think. So we'll start off. We have spoken briefly, and we were saying that we've both played around. You've played about 9.
Yeah, half a dozen games, pushing towards 10 games now. Yeah.
Yeah, so which is similar for me. So we've had a good little sort of a nice taster of the games and a few different armies and things like that. So first off, what are your first impressions of 9th edition?
I was really impressed actually when I first got the rule set that it's 8.5, isn't it? Like we were saying before, that it's the expanded 8th edition, but they have managed to completely change the game in terms of your balance of your armies. You know, how you're going to have to think about missions, particularly the complete focus on whether it's going to be a balance of infantry or tanks or a gun line or assault or reserves. Every aspect of the game has got really interesting. So I think it's been it's a really cool change. So my first reaction, absolutely love it. I think they've done a really good job with the core rules, and I think the change we saw at the end of 8th, where every couple of weeks, if there's a problem or an issue in the community, it gets raised and somebody FAQs it, is fantastic. So I think we're in for a really exciting 9th edition if that carries on through the rest.
Yeah, I feel the same. I love the way now I feel that I have done a good job in balancing bringing a more balanced game in terms of melee and shooting, and there's a lot of changes around the rules which don't look massive when you just look at it and you're like, oh yes, it's basically 8th edition with a few rule changes, and then when you actually play the game, you're like, this is a completely different game.
Yeah.
And I do love that, and I love that they've really looked at things and tried to balance things. So one of the big things that I really, really like since playing some games is the smaller board sizes. What's your views?
I think I was a bit hesitant at first. I was like, oh, it's going to be too small. And I think it'd be interesting to see how the new books come out. There are like some shooter units already that a 24-inch range before was okay. And now you're like, oh, bloody hell, that unit can get into range really quickly. Some of the new Space Marine units, like the Eradicators, for example, actually their value goes up once you factor in that smaller board size. And I do actually quite like it. It does mean that there's a lot more play for a lot of different units that maybe struggled when it was, you could be 72 inches and literally the other army is, 70 inches away from you. Yeah. So I think it's really interesting. Combined with the wealth of terrain rules, to say that we didn't have any last edition, I think that I'm personally waiting to see which way tournaments go in terms of standardized terrain and layouts and things. But that's going to be the next big factor with the small boards.
So I quickly just comment on one thing you said about the 24-inch guns.
Yeah.
For me, I played quite a few armies with 24-inch gun ranges in 8th edition, and it was a struggle. It was just so easy to outrange me and just move back and it really was a struggle. I mean, even when I was playing the attack bikes with melters, and even with their movement, it was just so hard. And now with the smaller boards, I think them 24-inch guns are going to be a lot more effective. Even like Necron Warriors, for instance, you're just going to be able to get into range.
Yeah, and it's twofold. I think it's because you've got the ranges. Ranges haven't changed, but you just brought together slightly more. But the objectives are fixed as well. And that, yes. I mean, obviously you can move your terrain on your tournament boards around that as well. But it means that, before when you were placing the objectives, well, you'd put it in a ruin as far away from the enemy as possible. Now it is forcing you out, and it is making armies interact a bit more. So you are seeing there is loads more play for loads of units that maybe,
which is great because the shorter gun ranges are then more effective because you're going to have to get into range. Your opponent's going to have to get into range to hold the objective. And then the other thing is that then makes melee armies better because you've got to come and hold them objectives. So then melee armies you're going to have to go and meet them. Yeah. So it makes that gun line not quite so horrific. Don't get me wrong, I'm sure there's still some horrific gun lines out there.
Oh yeah, yeah.
They just might be a little bit easier to. They might have to move. That's the thing. That's what it's doing. And what was the other thing? Terrain. Yeah, with tournaments. So I'm running a tournament at 40k in a couple of weeks, and at 40k there's a lot of varied terrain, which I love. Like, I feel like I want the game to have varied terrain, because I think if you are the best general, you should be able to play on a varied boards, as long as there is enough line of sight on there. Mm-hmm. So obviously not just completely make it a one-sided game, you know. But I like the fact that not every board is ruins or an L shape, you know. You might have to try, and there might be a lot of now dense cover where it's -1 to hit things, and just different. You've now got those different terrain traits. So I'd like to see more variety. The one thing I think that tournaments will struggle with, though, is because, I mean, the tournament I'm running's 28 people because of COVID, but it would have been 32 because it's not a massive place. But if I was to then take that and make it bigger, it's then having that amount of varied terrain, because having them L shapes and some small bits like that are easy to pack away, they're easy to get in boxes. Our tournament's going to have, like, big tournaments aren't really going to have very terrain.
I mean, that's the, like, from my experience of big events that I've been to around the world, like, I know the ones I've been to, ETC, for example, every year they have different issues with terrain and getting it together, and whether they store it, whether they keep it, move it between events, and things like the L shapes. Same with London, I believe. It's just easy to store and stack, and, you know, that is fundamentally why you have that terrain. And then it's the double side of it, I suppose, that when people are actually playing, there's hardly any rules issues about, I've got an L-shaped room with a base.
Yeah.
As opposed to this particular tree here, this rock shape, this Necron crystal, or, I mean, I've played at 40k, you know, things like some of the ice crystal boards and the Necron pillars, and you're like, is that impassable? Is it a wall you can walk over? But different people will have different arguments about those things. So, I mean, go to LVO. I've not been to LVO yet. I hope to one day, but I know that they have a massive investment, but they store that terrain and they have that ready to go. And they do have the set maps.
It is slightly more varied, I think, but not hugely.
Yeah, they try to have similar shaped pieces around the board, don't they? Maybe not exactly the same. Some are more open than others. You can see on some of the reports and coverage and streams. Yeah. So, I mean, Alliance Open, for example, I know that they're already putting out terrain maps and ideas about what they're going to use, for example, for their events coming forward. And I think you're just going to have to be bold as a TO and just go, this is the terrain I'm going to put for my event, and make some choices. Things like, do you keep that old ITC block in the bottom level? Or do you just go, no, the current rules allow for doors to be seen through and things like that, and just play it as it's in the book?
I mean, me and Andy have, and this is the difference as well with running a small tournament and then running a big tournament. Because me and Andy we had a meeting the other day. We went literally through terrain, and all of the terrain at his place, because he wants to use it for the club, obviously, so have these rules for the club and for the tournaments. And we're going to have literally little cards, and they're going to be ticked off what terrain traits each thing has. Now, with 14 tables, that's not too bad.
That's not too bad, yeah.
You go to 200 tables, that's a massive ball ache.
Oh yeah, that's that. But I mean, I suppose that's the joy of being able to run a smaller event as well. You can put a bit more detail in. You can put that level of tactical depth.
Yeah,
does make it interesting. You can still play Planet Bowling Ball, but with -1 to hit, +2 cover save trees, for example, all over the board.
Yeah.
So, right, and that'll be part of the challenge, I guess, for the guys at your events. That's going to be
fun. I think it makes it interesting. I mean, it's always that thing that I worry about with varied terrain in a tournament scenario. Is I don't ever want someone to leave feeling like they lost because of the terrain. Do you know what I mean?
Do you know what? There were bits of 8th edition and tournaments 8th edition. I know people felt like that. I mean, I helped run some of the events up at Ellen Games with the, like, Caledonian stuff. Again, we did things like we borrowed terrain from other gaming clubs, and Glasshammer helped out loads of times. They were really good for us. But, like, we had complaints once where we put all the Glasshammer team across the top and middle, but we ran out. So we'd use some of the elements terrain, and people said, well, it's too sparse. And you're like, well, we're literally physically limited by what the venue's got, for example, in that case. So coming back to your event with 40K, at least you can go, cool, I want this to look like this board to look like that. And events going forward, I think they will have. I think L-shaped ruins and things are here to stay. It's just now whether people keep with like, this is a giant 5-inch tall L and it's line of sight blocking all the way through. Or do they go, it's got a door in, so current rules. If you're in the ruin, you see through the door. Behind the ruin, can't be seen. Yeah. I mean, I've been playtesting with those rules in that, if you're in the big L and you can see through the gap or the door or the window, you can be seen. I do quite like it. I think it's just a bit more tactical that you can hide a tank behind the ruin, but it's that choice to push it in to see through and be seen in it. So I suppose it a bit more
because I mean, line of sight is line of sight. True line of sight is the thing if you're in the ruin, but it's only if you're behind the ruin that then it creates that line of sight, which I think is cool because it allows an army to get up, to move up, to or it allows you to do a bit of tactical manoeuvring around the piece of obscuring terrain. But if you want to get up and start pushing in, then you're going to become more visible once you're in a ruin than if you were behind it. Yeah. So I quite like that.
No, I think they've done a really good job with the terrain rules. Like I said, it's just for events to catch up. It's a big change from what we were used to, and it was so just I mean, let's be honest. Last edition was mostly area terrain, a couple of craters, hills, or ruins. That was it.
I mean, it literally the terrain rules was so
bland, weren't they? Yeah.
Bland and basic, and it made for you almost couldn't use anything else. Like it was just, we're just going to use some ruins basically, and we could use a crater, and that's about it.
But again, it was a shooty edition, and it was long distance, and the idea was, I mean, lots of events were going. We've got big line of sight blockers in the middle because we want to give a person who hasn't got a shooty army a chance going second. Don't feel necessarily like that's as bad this edition. However, whether or not going first or second is massive with the current missions is a different argument, I suppose.
Yeah, I mean, that's a good point. What are your feelings on deployment and the second turn?
I mean, I think I've probably gone a 50-50 mix in my game so far, first and second. I've won and lost in both. Yeah.
You've chosen first. Or
do you know?
Have you ever chosen to go second? That's a good question. Yeah.
Yes, okay. I have. Depending on the army that I was using, but that was as much just a test as well, and just to go, okay, I don't know. I want to be able to see what you push on the objectives first turn, so I can clear it off.
Yeah.
So I kind of like that mechanic. I mean, I'm sure there'll be people that build lists to go first, get on the objectives, and be immovable, and there'll be people that play a list that can go second and just blitz whatever's there. I don't think it's too bad. I just think that that's the thing. You've got to take it on the chin, that you can't take your 8th edition list, plug it into 9th and go, I'll just score points and I'll win games. You have to understand that you have to be able to have multiple units on an objective and cover it. You can't just chuck 5 rangers on a unit, like objective at the back. I mean, God, my plane list I used to run last edition was so guilty of that. 2 units of rangers hiding in the ruin, sitting on objectives, scoring me the objectives all game because they're -2 to hit or they're in reserve for 3 turns. You just can't do that anymore. Those kind of units don't have that utility. It's things like, do you bring 4 or 5 units? Do you bring a unit in a transport? So if they pop the transport, the guys get out and sit on the objective. And then there's a character with them and he's screening and he's holding it. Yeah, just so many different ways you've got to think about it now. Yeah. I love list building. That's one of my things that really draws me into the game. Coming up with the combos, you catch things to catch people out. So when I can put it together on the table, I'm like, yes, that works. Yeah, it's like a thought in theory. So I don't think it's as big, but if you're not ready for it, you're just going to get stung by somebody who is.
I think that for me, first and second is, like you say, some armies will really want to go first. Like it will, really, they'll almost rely on it. And I found I played, which will probably be already on the channel by the time this comes out, I played Death Guard with my White Scars. And we played 2 games. I only filmed one of them. But it almost was... So I went first in the first game and I won, and he went first in the second game and he won. But I said to him, it's not the first turn that it mattered. It was the second turn. Because what happened is it was almost the second turn was when we done our damage. So it was almost whoever went first on the second turn sort of took enough out that then when they replied with their second turn, they didn't take as much because some of their big hitters had been taken out. So the damage had almost already been done.
I mean, I've seen that argument on some of the Facebook forums and things like that, where people are going, "Oh, if you go second, you're just doomed because you can't. The other guy goes first, gets all his objectives. How are you meant to get your objectives and kill his stuff off? And then he gets, do you know what I mean? He gets a couple of turns to kill your things before they can do it." And I'm like, well, that's it then, isn't it? You've got to build the list to do that. You've got to go half my games. I'm going to go second. Yeah. So if I go second, how do I win the game?
I also found as well, because my list was, I've got a bit of deep strike and a bit of strategic reserves coming from strategic reserves, that the other thing that was against me if my opponent goes first is they've obviously spread out more work point. So then that's harder for me to bring the stuff on. But again, it's just something you've got to play around. And it doesn't matter to my list too much how much they spread out, because I can come on and do what I was planning to do anyway, because they would have spread the units out to where I can get to them. But it was interesting. And also, I wouldn't have even said, because it was very different in terms of the board, the deployment setup. So it was sort of Dawn of War was the first one, which really suited me and didn't suit him. And it was almost sort of a hammer anvil type one for the second game, which he won, which really suited him and didn't suit me so much. So it might not have even been the first and second thing. It could have been to do with the deployment, you know, unless you're going to play the same game with the same deployment and first, second, and the mission, because some missions, the missions on the second game were the objectives were closer together, which suited his, because he was playing the Death Guard 4-up-in-1 demon engine list, and so all of the objectives being nice and close together suited him, because he wanted to keep them all in his bubble.
Yeah, they want to stay in the bubble and have the 7-inch buffs and everything. And like plague weapon reroll wounds and crap.
Whereas the first mission, the objectives were quite spread out. So then he had to spread out more, which then took him out of his bubble, which allowed me to kill him a lot easier. So
I mean, I know when the book came out, it was leaked initially. Lots of people were saying it's like, oh, it's ITC light, isn't it? It's going to be just ITC missions with Games Workshop. It's not. I think they've taken on board that people like being able to pick their missions in ITC. That's the reason why the tournament format was popular. So they kept that in. But there's enough variety between the deployments and the objective spreads. You know, sometimes it's 5, sometimes it's 6. There's enough, I think, to make the game definitely really interesting.
Yes, I agree. And I like the fact also that the primary there's 2 different primaries. And so many people have missed this. Obviously, we haven't had the Grand Tournament book, and I'm talking about in the Grand Tournament book here, in the missions. There's the domination primary and the take and hold. And the take and hold's the hold 1, hold 2, hold more than your opponent. And then the domination's hold 2, hold 3, hold more than your opponent. And I like the fact it is slightly different. So it's almost like, and it's a lot harder to score that domination, like I've found. Take and hold, I'm like, yeah, I can get these points. I can pretty much max out my primaries. Goes to domination, my list starts struggling to hold that many objectives, consistently, and try and deny my opponent. So it is interesting how much just that one thing changes how good my list was working.
Yeah.
So which is really cool. What do you think on the secondaries? This is quite a good, because you obviously were playing you play ETC style, or WTC now.
Oh, WTC now, yeah. World Team Championship.
Style a lot more than you played ITC, I understand.
Well, I mean, I suppose I did maybe a couple of years ago, but nobody wants to play that anymore. I mean, I think it's probably good for ETC players that the game's changed, and that currently, or WTC players and people who liked the format maybe will be a bit sad, but WTC was always the core rule book. And so if it was, the rule book was these primary objective missions, and then Maelstrom was always in the mission, was as if set. So WTC always said, well, we'll take whatever Games Workshop wrote, we'll put that together. We will have to comp it, because some of these are unbalanced. So things that we talked about before, like faction-specific Maelstrom missions, for example, which were unbalanced. They just went, well, we won't have those in. We'll reduce the Maelstrom deck down so that things like, what was it? Where the Warlord could pull a Maelstrom card, then he could do that mission, and it could get like 8 points because it was hold an objective, and it got, things like that were overpowered in tournament play. Now it's going to be cool because we're all going to be on the same game. And the last couple of years for singles, it's all been ITC, because ITC has just spiked in popularity. Because I think as 40K moved from 7th to 8th, whether people like eighth or not, eighth has really, really grown 40k.
Oh,
Really
massively,
popular.
yeah.
You know, it's probably one of the top tabletop games in the world, and there's just, you know, people want to play it all over. People will travel all over Europe and America for the big events. So I think very rarely in the UK were you seeing an ETC event. There were one or two people that were going, yeah, I'm going to stick with that. That's what we've always run. But most have gone to ITC because that's the format that people want. And then because that, I think, you know, casual gamers or people who are going to their first event could more easily pick up the rules, practice their list, go and play. And I think as we're coming to ninth, that's just going to be great, isn't it? We're all going to be on the same page.
I didn't like the fact that there was a lot of different things out there, because I was like, not only do you have to learn different things then, but it's also, you know, if someone goes to, for instance, the WTC tournament and wins, or, you know, however that was WTC style tournament and wins, and someone goes to an ITC tournament, I mean, the list could be completely different, and it's not even really the same game.
Yeah, and I mean, like, again, I used to help ref and run some of the events, like I said, and like you bounce from like an event in January, which is ITC, where you literally hardly did any refing and any rules questions because it's ITC and it's on the pack. Then you go to the next month to ETC, and every round you'd be like announcing how the mission worked and going around the tables, checking they put the objective in the right order and checking that they weren't using this Maelstrom mission. You're like,
yeah.
But equally, then that was again to balance the game and make it like WTC was always, well, actually, this is the rule book missions they've said, and it does balance the game. ITC did swing it to, you wanted to go second, you wanted to get hold more and kill more. So that, do you know what I mean? That was, you were building armies to tick those secondary lists.
And I love the fact that it's all now going to be from the same book, and we're all on the same page, like you say. So actually going to the secondaries, because obviously if you've played ITC, anyone that's played ITC that's watching, you know the secondaries, you always sort of tried to take secondaries that you knew you were going to max out, or, you know, you knew you were going to score very high on. Whereas I have found, especially at the minute, because we haven't got the secondaries from the codexes, that sometimes, depending on what faction you're playing, sometimes it can be quite limiting. And quite often, you know that you're not going to score full points on these secondaries, which I don't think is a bad thing necessarily.
Well, that's it, isn't it? I think that's what they're trying to do. They're going, cool, you can get 45 for secondaries. You're probably not going to get 45 for secondaries. Just like primaries, you can get your 45. You're probably not going to. Yeah. If your opponent's got any, you know, sort of nous about them and they're trying to thwart your plans. I love the range of secondaries. I think it's really cool. I do think some of them are a bit like we talked about pre-call, where we said, you know, some codexes have faction rules where you're just like, why have you got this one in the same group as these ones? Because this one's outstanding. Like we talked about Prophets of the Flesh, didn't we, in the Covenants for Dark Eldar. Some of the secondaries are like, why would you pick this one when you've got this one in the same category? Yeah. You know,
I mean, sometimes me and Ollie were talking, actually, who I played with, who had the Death Guard list, and he was like, he took While We Stand, We Fight.
Yeah.
Which is the one where you pick 3 units, and if they're alive at the end, you get 5 points for each unit that's still alive. And he was like, this is the only army that I can think that I would pick this for, because you've got to pick your most expensive units, I believe. And
so it's single model units.
Oh, single model units.
So
okay.
That's a really interesting one. Like that, loads of people might just write that off and go, yeah, that's terrible. But others might go, okay, cool. So I'm going to take these 3 characters,
because you could build around it,
and go, yeah. And I think that's that extra layer, isn't it? Where before in ITC, you just generically build an army that was trying not to give up the secondaries. There's a couple in this where now you don't want to do that. Where like the attrition one that lets you kill more units in the battle round. You don't want to be giving your opponent 3 points a turn just by killing 2 or 3 because you've got 100 units, for example. And you don't. Mech might suffer with Bring It Down, but I mean, I've been playtesting some lists that are just heavy mech and just going, well, I'll just see. Because if the list is effective enough at getting the primaries and spreading on the board and shooting effectively, maybe I just spam these units out and I go, okay, then you can really focus on that 15. I mean, you Bring It Down. It's kill 5 reasonably sized tanks, or kill 6 or 7 small ones.
Yeah. And I think I quite like the I think it's called Grind Them Down, which is the attrition one.
Yeah.
I like, because you got something, again, you've got something like, for instance, Gene Stealer Cult that has got so many units that are easy to kill. So, I mean, you're pretty much, if you play against Gene Stealer Cult or Orcs, or, you're probably going to be taking Grind Them Down, because, most lists you'll kill more units than you're gonna lose. But then, like you say, if you've got a heavy mech list, then someone's going to say, bring it down. And so, yeah, it might be that you're going to go, okay, I'll give away that secondary, but I'm going to try and deny another 2, so.
I think it's too early to tell whether some lists like that are a liability. I mean, I'm sure some people will be shouting at this going, well, you just don't build like this. That's stupid. But I mean, last edition, I know ITC format, lots of big players would say, oh, well, you know what? I don't care if you can score your secondaries. I'm just going to score mine, and I'm going to outscore you on the primary.
Yeah.
I think that's really where the edition is at the beginning, until we see more secondary missions that you can really comp for. At the moment, it's I'm going to score my secondaries as much as possible, and I'm going to score my primary.
Yeah.
And that wins me the game. And if you get 15 for Bring It Down, fantastic. But if I get 45 points for secondaries, I'm absolutely rolling.
Yeah. I mean, and that is the thing, isn't it? Because I think the primary is easier to score than the secondaries the majority of the time. So if you've got the primary sorted and you feel like you're going to win on the primary, then secondaries, you probably, you could hopefully get that. So you're going to score enough that you'll end up getting the game if you're winning on primaries,
Yeah.
So what was I had another thing in my, what we were going to talk about. Oh yeah, lists for 9th edition. So we've obviously been talking about lists and secondaries and building this around it. But what do you think at the moment? So we'll talk a little bit. Let's talk about points first. Let's talk about points. So obviously they've released the points for 9th edition. There's been a lot of, what should we say? Anger and disappointment in the points releases and some excitement. I know there's a few armies that feel they've been really hard done by. And I know you were saying that you've tested Gene Stealer Cult. You've had a few games with them, and they're one of the armies that I think a lot of people feel have been really hit hard in the points.
I think take them as an example. That's just an army where the big units in the playstyle from last edition was X and Y. I think maybe that attracted like if you were attracted to that list as a player, you can't play that list now.
Yeah,
it just doesn't work like that. You can't run 3 units of Aberrants and drop them in and smash everything up and have loads of chaff at the back that's fearless and hiding. You just can't do it. Partly because the chaff's gone up, partly because the Aberrants have gone up, because you can't have as many characters, because to have all the characters you used to have in multiple detachments costs you loads of CPs. You haven't got as many CPs. I mean, the list for them is probably longer than any other faction. But like take my Eldar Flyer list. Well, that's literally physically impossible to field in this edition.
Oh yeah, because you haven't got the air wings.
Well, you haven't got the air wing, and the points of planes have gone up.
Yeah.
So I'm like, it's like nearly 1,200 points for 6 planes, and arguably it's probably about right, isn't it? Really, because GW have generically placed most of the planes pretty close together, unless it's like a Storm Raven or something like that. Yeah. But I think again, they're changing the focus of the edition completely, and they're going to be bold with some things. And yes, it might hurt your army at the beginning, but you've got to hope that they're going to then go through all the codexes and go, right, it is quite a big change. All the codexes need a tweak. It's not going to be like Death Watch White Dwarf style Codex Light, where it's just some updated rules and that's it. That they're going to think about the secondaries, the points values, the combos, and that some of those points are with those things in mind, maybe to give people a chance to build in the right way. Some of the points changes feel a bit arbitrary. Some of the war gear options and things where you're like, oh, that's 0. That's fantastic.
Yeah.
There's a few Forge World culprits that I've seen suddenly appear in every list. And I know we mentioned the Scorpius has gone up like 20 points. So
yeah.
You
were saying about is it the Chinook?
The Orc Chinook, the Landspeeder Tempest. I mean, these are all things that are featured from lists that have won over the weekend. So like the Chinook is a dirt cheap transport for orcs. It's Forge World. Basically, its war gear options have gone down to 0. Have you seen the Landspeeder Tempest?
No.
Oh, so it's a Landspeeder, shocker, but it's got a twin Tempest Salvo launcher, which is strength 6 -2 D3 damage. It's got like 4 or 6 shots with that, I think, and an assault cannon. it has a rule where it can fly, and in the turn that it flies, it's -1 to hit and can't be assaulted. So it becomes like a flyer for a turn.
Oh, wow.
It doesn't actually lose the ability to contest any objectives or to hold anything or to speed near a table edge. So you can combine that with things like salamanders giving it obsec, or just going near the board edge and controlling a secondary, and you're like, oh, 80 points for one of those. Fantastic.
Oh, wow.
Yeah, I'll take one of those.
Yeah.
Amazing. That's just the tip of the iceberg. I mean, the Taunar, over on Art of War.
That went down, didn't
Richard
it?
Siegler's been using that against poor old Nick Nanavati and kicking his backside with it a couple of times. Yeah, that went down to like 900 points from like 12 or 1500, whatever it was before. So before, it was basically unplayable because it was so expensive. And now it's so dirt cheap. You're like, oh, too far the other way.
Yeah,
So,
I felt like that may have done that with the. I mean, I don't know what that, if the Lord of Skulls has changed. No, was it Lord of Skulls? Yeah,
yeah, the big corner.
yeah, it went down, didn't it, at the end of 8th, and people started banning, and they were pretty decent for their points.
Yeah,
and I don't think they went up too much.
But you see, some units have been really fairly, like, I think, really fairly costed. I was talking with a friend the other day about the Centurions, and lots of people moan that they've been nerfed. Probably pretty fairly priced for the firepower they've got. I mean,
I don't know. I didn't look at the. I've only played the Assault Centurions, which are now 70 points if you take them with the Hurricane Bolter, or 55 without. And they've still got 2 flamers. They've still hitting straight 3 damage, strength 10, -3 or 4 in combat. And I'm like, I think 55 points is pretty
relative
pretty
balance
good.
wise. I think they're pretty good, and you compare it to other stuff across the factions. I mean, some tanks and some planes is where you go, how is that the same price? And we've talked about some of the basic troops where you're like how is a Cabalite Warrior 8 and the Guardsman's 5?
The Cavalry was 9.
No, sorry, even worse.
Yeah.
9, and a
nearly double the price. Yeah.
Yeah, and that's obviously because somebody hasn't maybe thought about what you can do with the Guardsman, that you can just double move it for free, and in an objective holding game, you get them across the board onto the other person's objective turn 1, make it annoying, give them a 5+ invuln, make them -1 to hit, make them fearless. I mean, there's just so many options for some of these lists. So that's where I think the points, little bits where you're like, right, in the current book, maybe it's over or under costed. Maybe the new book will change that. Maybe the new book will be,
because I think Drukhari was a very interesting army when you looked at their points. Obviously, they didn't get anything in Psychic Awakening apart from some obsessions, which arguably there was about 3 or 4 that were usable.
There's like one Witch Cult one that's usable, one Coven's one that you can use, but then it just means you're not going to be Prophet of the Flesh. So you're probably not going to use it.
Yeah.
And then the Cobalite ones are just literally morale in close combat for your shooty Dark Elder faction.
Why?
Yeah.
But then, so the smaller boards have probably hindered certain builds of Drukhari, because obviously Prophets of Flesh will still be good on smaller boards because less place to go and they're good at holding objectives. But I mean, like your Raiders, your Ravagers, and everything else aren't going to like smaller boards so much because they can't just move, shoot, keep moving away, and that sort of thing. And then they put the Disintegrators up by 10 points, which you're like, right, so your Ravager's gone up by 30 points plus whatever the Ravager went up anyway. And along with the troops being hit quite hard, and then you're like, now you're starting to point this whole army out of like existence, you know?
I think that's your issue, isn't it? When you get like a unit that was like, you know, maybe at one point in that edition, 125 points for a Ravager with 2 Disintegrators was really good value.
Oh,
so
yeah.
when I ran 3 of those
probably
at LGT,
too cheap.
Yeah, probably too cheap. And 155 after the points bump, you're like, okay, that's about right. Then 170, 180, you're like, oh, I don't know if it's any good. And then you go, oh, okay, I could take these 3 Space Marine Eradicators for 120 points. And they've got 6 melter shots if they shoot the first target. And they can be salamanders. They can reroll a hit, reroll a wound.
Yeah.
And they're toughness 5 with 3 wounds each. And they're probably going to be in cover. And they can assault move and still do it. And you're like, yeah, that's 120. Yeah. Does my Ravager, on average, kill my 120 point around? No. Do my Eradicators kill the Ravager? Oh my God, yeah.
Yeah.
That's you know, I don't mind in 40k if my 150 points a model doesn't kill your 150 points. but I hate it when there's such a big disparity when you go, oh, this one's got all these buffs and this unit suffers.
See, as well though, the Eradicators wouldn't be as good if it wasn't for strategic reserves. Because strategic reserves, you just go, and then you just annihilate whatever it is.
But that's another way around your gun line set in the back of the board, isn't it?
Yes.
I mean, I mentioned some lists here, but I think before we started the call about that I've seen win over the weekend. They've got elements that just sat at the back and were for long range firepower and didn't really move. And I was really surprised that people didn't try and use the reserves rules to outflank or to hide stuff or to move things into range. Do you know what I mean? And possibly that's just a mindset thing that people haven't got into ninth and gone, okay, if I face a gun line, I need to dig something out of the corner, I can outflank, I can move around. I've been stung by that already. I mean, twice actually in 2 different games. One, I moved the unit on from reserves and underestimated that you could put a unit of assault centurions on the backboard within 9, an inch away from the board edge, and shoot one unit and remove another. I'm like, okay, that's good. And then another one where even with 9-inch range, it gave them so much more reach with a shooter unit that it could remove another one of my flanking units was holding an objective. So much play with the reserves. You just got to be a bit bolder with your CPs, I think, and go, yeah, cool.
Yeah, and I think it's again one of those things. It's new, so people aren't used to it yet. Once people and I'm sure people will start building lists around strategic reserves, and you know, I mean, I already have started to in terms of the way I'm thinking about what I can do with Centurions, what I can do with Eradicators, and things like that. Because
some of these short range units are amazing now. If you can just drop them in 6 inches off the board edge, turn 2, turn 3, or that. The amount of people that I keep seeing, they've missed in the GT pack that your reserves have to come in turn 3.
Yeah, I know. I there's a couple of people because it doesn't say anything in the core rule book, and then you look at the GT pack, and it's like, no, they have to be in by turn 3, unless you're Gene Stealer Cult, and
you can chuck them back in.
You can take the 3, but even the 3 you take off, because you can take off 3 when you set up the blips, can't you?
Yeah.
There's a stratagem to put 3 units in reserve. They don't have to come in because it literally says anything that's started.
Oh, I thought they fact that. I thought they fact it in the last edition.
They did in the last edition.
Has it not survived in the FAQ?
Well, I don't think so. Because is it still? Because
I'll have to check. I don't know off my head.
That new rule that's in the GT pack would overrule it. And what that rule says is anything that starts off the board has to come in turn 3. But that means anything you take off after the first turn starts, which you would be taking off after the first battle round begins, then that can stay in as long as you want. So Gene Stealer Cult.
Well, I mean, I think that was the argument last edition. So I would expect that to be another nail in the Gene Stealer Cult coffin.
Well, maybe that's why they had so many horrendous points up.
Oh yeah, that's what it was. Yeah, somebody got touched by an aberrant once, and that was it. No more.
But yeah, so it's very. I think there was a few things that some people missed. You know, things that sometimes I miss things, and then someone was like, "Oh, no, it's actually in the GT book," and you actually realise how many differences there are in the GT 2020 book, Grand Tournament 2020 book, than there is in the actual core rule book.
Yeah, I think that. Do you know what? There's little things you miss. Like a friend of mine had missed the way that modifiers work on hit rolls, with the cap of -1 and +1, because sometimes you just skip. I think when you switch editions, sometimes you go hit rolls. Well, I know how they work, and you move on to the next little bit.
Yeah.
So not everybody is as
and I think that's
on
happened,
social media and YouTube watching stuff and capping
exactly.
it.
I think that's happened with so much stuff like heroic intervention.
Oh yeah, I've caught somebody with that.
So you can heroically intervene, but now, whereas before, because you weren't declared as a charge target, you couldn't be hit, but now you can be hit.
Yeah,
which is quite nice, and the fact that I've seen a lot of people get messed up with the. So if it's my turn and I've charged Tony, but we had already had a unit that were in combat, then after my charging unit's gone, then Tony goes first because it's on my turn, which has really changed, I think, the game in terms
of... That's massive, actually. Yeah, that's a really good change. That makes it so much more interesting with terms of throwing units in and being able to, like again, you come back to your Gene Stealer Cults. Like, you might try and lock something up with hybrids or whatever, but then actually you could lose them in the start of the next combat round because they don't get that fight first. You don't get your charges, and then that unit goes in. So you can have your charge, and then somebody interrupts, and then somebody fights with their unit as well, and you lose a lot more. So it's. I know you keep saying that melee armies have got some buffs. I do think melee armies are initially struggling a little bit. A hard-hitting melee unit is good, but I don't know if an army focus. I don't know if an army focus around it is going to survive well in the
Yeah,
siege.
I'm not sure if you'd want to go full melee, but like I think that but the other thing is that pretty much, other than you've got a specific rule, nothing can fall back and shoot. So if you are charging a lot of units that don't really want to be in combat, then if they've all got to then fall back, because once you charge them all, their options are falling back or staying in combat. If they stay in combat, you get to hit them again first. If they fall back, then they don't get to shoot or do anything. Even if they're a psycho, they don't get to psych. So you sort of have, I mean, obviously I know they can fall back and then the rest of the army can shoot at you, but it sort of depends how well your opponent's screening, how much they've got to screen, whether you can actually charge their good units, how much maneuverability has your melee army got to charge the good units and things like that in it, I suppose. Which is why, like, with White Scars, I quite like the captain with the flying bike, because you can just fly over terrain and then just get to whatever you want to get to. Whereas you've got, with the normal bikes, you've got to deal with the screen.
Well, I mean, it's interesting again, because people at the start of the edition leaks were saying, well, screens are going to go. People aren't going to have the points for it. People aren't going to allocate things for screens. I think maybe what you screen with is just different. Again, you know, like Space Marines can do it so well with some of the 12-inch no deep strike zoning screens to begin with, let alone before you put transhuman or -1 to wound on some of those units as well. So there's really cool options in different books to block and to screen with. I think it's just going to be, I always like edition changes because it's cool to see the first couple of big events when they happen and see people go, oh, that's a really clever list. That's a really cool combo, to see the way that somebody's taken a list that you wouldn't have expected from before. Yeah.
And I do really like, I like seeing people come up with new things, you know, and I'm like, oh, that's really cool idea. I like what they've done with that. And what I like it even more is if it's like, I suppose, the part of me that wants to see an army look like an army. Do you know what I mean? Like, I like it if it looks like it should be an army as well, more so, and it's really competitive. I like that sort of thing. I mean, it doesn't happen too much because usually you end up having to spam the things that are the most efficient, and that's the way it is, you know.
Yeah.
But yeah, it's very interesting. So I suppose the last thing to sort of, well, one of the things I wanted to talk about was the Psychic Awakening books, specifically with like Death Guard and Custodes. It seems like that book, which was called War of the Spider, that book, I feel, has done both factions a lot of good.
But there are two factions that are like limited in unit choice. I mean, I know the Custodes really, if you don't have Forge World, that doesn't function anywhere near as well. Because a lot of flavorful units have come out in that. And maybe down the line with Forge World being integrated into Games Workshop, whatever that means, maybe that will see Forge World units in a codex. I mean, that would be interesting to see. I mean,
they've said that the rules writers have said they're going to write, the GW rules writers are now going to write the Forge World books.
So at that point, you're like, well, you know what? If you're all one big money-making machine, put your rules together. People will buy it, and you know it's.
But there's a good way to make another people buy more books, isn't it?
I suppose. Yeah, well, there is that argument. Yeah, I mean, but the two of the oldest books, but they have some really cool models. They just needed options. They needed updating for the edition. I think it's been nice to see some of the updates that maybe with Ninth in mind. Custodes have got some great options for a limited army because, you know, they're already coming in strong with their survivable and their obsec. They weren't too badly hit with points, and then they've got the extra damage reduction strats you've got in there are amazing. Their characters are absolutely just baller anyway. And then Death Guard, there's some really just obnoxious units.
Yeah.
But with 4+ invuns and reroll and 1s and 2s and feel no pain.
Yeah.
Demon engines with 4+ invun saves. Hidden units at the back with Cloud of Flies. I mean, there's so many different versions.
And again, the smaller boards help both of them armies.
Yes.
You know, because obviously Death Guard don't want to have to move vast distances. They're a slow army generally. They don't want to have to move too far. They're quite happy to go and sit in the middle and be like, right, we're going to survive longer than you. And again, Custodes, I mean, the Custodes bikes are nice and fast, but everything else is relatively slow and you don't want to have to be moving it across the board.
But I think it's twofold, isn't it? Because you can't like before with Custodes bikes, you could just, whether it was ITC or ETC or WTC missions, you could just kind of seed the board to them a little bit early game, wait for them to drop if they had a big bike unit in reserves, and then push back, or even just alpha strike them and push onto them. Now, you kind of have to, that latter option is really the thing. You have to push out and try and alpha them and try and take them out. Because if you give them the board, they're just on all the objectives. They're getting all the primary. They've probably picked secondaries about holding the center and having, raised the banner and things like that. So you can't just let them have the board and throw these units in. Because now, whilst you might still kill these units, the game's 5 turns, so they can score big for 3. That's it. You score big for 3, and you probably pushed it over. And then, you raise the banner, and the guy hiding at the back will tide you in. Not being able to be tabled and just losing all your points is a big change as well.
Yeah.
Because ITC had gone to that at the end, hadn't it? But it's
so GW with their last lot of missions, hadn't they? The last chapter proved it was acceptable casualties, I think it was called. Yeah. So it was like you can be tabled now, and you can still just play out the points and play out the game, which is a huge thing. It's a huge change.
It means you can play that Custodes list and play it balls to the wall and go, right, I'm just going to freaking go for it and absolutely throw my units in and try and kill as much as possible and just kill off your speed or kill off your range.
Yeah.
And hopefully accrue enough points that I can just get over the line. So.
And War of the Spider has made them far more durable. They've got the 4 up. You can't wound them on better than a 4. And the Terminators have got the ignore -1 and -2, which is really, really nice, especially when you're playing against Thousand Suns.
I've got to say, well, with some of the Psychic Awakenings, that I suppose doesn't annoy me. It just kind of confuses me about how whoever writes those rules perceives the power level of some armies against how I do, and then the buffs that those give to the armies. I mean, Admech are definitely top tier army now. Even with the nerf in the FAQ recently to Psychic Awakening, that meant before they could stack the Holy Order Warlord traits. Did you see those? So basically, they've got 4 Holy Orders. Yes. That each have 3 different Warlord traits. Start your turn, you pick one of the 3. So before, you could pay a CP to have 3 or 4 of those traits. So you're stacking those into your army. So you were having fall back and shoot on your units, along with exploding 6s and extra rend. So now you've only got one of those buffs. Oh no, terrible.
Yeah.
But it's still so customizable, and their units are really offensively pointed, and they've got extra canticles, and they've got extra things. You compare that to a Dark Eldar, a selection of Covens that don't work, no extra relics, no real
nothing. I did literally anything apart from some obsession.
I know from things we hear and from things that playtesters say that they write these things in advance, because we talked together on that before the call, didn't we, about lead times and production. But it still baffles me that you go a year ago, were Dark Eldar the top of the meta list that didn't need many buffs? The Eldar ones, for example, Eldar, we've got most people run custom traits now because the custom craft world traits are great. You can really go, I want to tweak my shurikens, because shuriken is such a big fundamental core weapon in the army with the troops and the tanks. I can build around that. Or I can stack my Exarch powers on my Aspect Warriors in certain ways. Some great combos for craft world Eldar. Whereas again, you come back to GC the Cult we've mentioned. They've got a couple of powers that are useful. They didn't get any relics, and they got custom traits that are basically the ones they already had, but not in any way that you would combine them.
I found it really interesting that GC the Cult and Drukhari, if you look at GC the Cult and Drukhari, they've both got quite similar codexes. And I mean similar in terms of there's some real quirky, cool things you can do. There's that thing where you can get 3 Warlord traits in both codexes. And there's some similarities. They've both sort of got Vect and that sort of thing. And they were both, not just with the 9th points, but throughout 8 seem to have got either hit or not shown any love when there was Psychic Awakening come out, for instance. And I was wondering if there was something that they saw in that they didn't like, or they thought the codexes worked too well. They were too powerful, these 2 codexes.
I mean,
it wasn't like they were absolutely destroying everything, was it?
I know, when the Aberrants got their points hike in the chapter approved, that's because 6 months ago when they'd written the book, really, the rumors that came out were, this was done in kind of February time, when Aberrants were a big build, and they were maybe too good for the faction, but they were the big unit in the faction that you took. So they put that point bump in, and then the game had moved on as well.
Yeah.
With the newer rules, it had already kind of pushed aberrance out a little bit, and you're like, oh, okay, that was the extra kind of just knock on the head to make that unit not competitive enough.
And it's also it's almost like they need to find a way, which the easiest way would be obviously to have everything digital, but they're not going to do that. But they need to find a way where they can adjust things a little bit quicker, or which is obviously the FAQs and things like that. But I mean, if you're writing chapter approved for a game that was 6 months to a year ago, then it's not going to be right. The point changes aren't going to be correct unless you haven't changed anything else about that game.
Yeah, but I mean, that's the thing with it being 9th. I think that the field manual with the updated points is just a starter point. It's like the indexes. It's not meant to be horribly balanced. We shouldn't go, oh my God, Games Workshop thinks that this Centurion's worth this and the Great Tusk is worth this. They've just gone, well, you want your army balance to generally be the same, but this is probably relative to this, and we'll tweak it as we go, and off they go. And new codexes will be thick and fast, I guess.
Yeah, I hope so. I mean, I think that they probably had a bit of a struggle with the old COVID thing and getting back up to the production levels that they want to be at, and trying to restock all them stores and getting all that stuff out is probably taking some time, which is why I thought maybe that the Space Marine and Necrons Codex, if they are the first two, which I'm assuming they are coming out in October. Because I was like, I expect them to be out in like August, beginning of September, end of August, beginning of September. So maybe they're just trying to catch up with some stuff, and then after that, hopefully they'll come out fairly thick and fast. Because we said again, pretty cool, like tabletop tactics, from what they have said and what I can gather from what they're saying is that they've had every codex, they've pointed every codex or helped point every codex. We can't blame them for all the points, and that they have had these, and so therefore, without any other rule changes from what they've been playing, the unit should be relatively balanced. But something I wanted to touch on was like Ravagers, for instance. We spoke about Ravagers. Ravagers with disintegrator cannons. The disintegrator cannons have gone up 10 points to 25 points, which probably a little bit too much. I wanted to see disintegrators go up to 20 points ages ago in 8th edition, just because they're really a really efficient gun. They're really good. They were perfect for a lot of jobs. And a Dark Lance was 20 points and a disintegrator was 15, and it just made no sense. And I thought, I'm sitting here saying it's making no sense. Drukhari players are sitting there saying it's making no sense. Why is a one-shot weapon, which is D6 damage, which is unreliable, over a three-shot weapon, which is, reliably dealing sort of reliable damage? And it wasn't never a choice. Do I take a Dark Lance or do I take a Disintegrator? I'm taking Disintegrator because they're cheaper.
I think again, that's it comes to what you're playtesting and how you're playtesting it with, I guess. Because if you play an army with a bit of a mixed bag of everything, with some infantry, some tanks, some characters, some reserves, your Dark Lance might be really good because it can pop a tank, it can pop a big thing, it can damage a character. But 8th edition felt very much like the aim was to have a big ass handful of dice and to roll as many dice as possible, and just throw enough shit at the wall and you'll knock it over. And if you don't play test it like that and then you give it to players and they use it like that, it's very different. So
that's true.
like your Ravagers going to 255, well, I mean, I wasn't too unhappy with that, because actually your 9 Disintegrators are probably going to on average do more damage to a tank than 3 Dark Lances.
Yeah.
But that's, I believe, from people I've spoken to in chats and things and forums, whatever, that's why like twin heavy bolters have gone up in price and heavy bolters have gone up. Because if you were comparing your average damage for a heavy bolter compared to a las cannon against the big target, actually on average, your heavy bolter would chip away wounds nearly as efficiently. So they've gone, well, actually, efficiency-wise, that's how we need to point things.
Yeah.
So hopefully they get that right. I mean, again, your new stuff coming out of the boxes is dirt cheap. But
that stuff of weapons and efficiency of weapons is why they brought in blast weapons. And they've sort of, and obviously trying to combat or kill hordes. So
I think there was a real danger with the way they did this edition. It's cool making all these changes to missions and secondaries, but if they didn't find a way to stop hordes being a massive part of the meta, then the game was going to be broken by plague bearer bombs in big blobs of 30 or like 200 fearless hormigans across the board. And it might still be dominated by some of those.
I was going to say, I still think that's going to be strong.
Yeah, but and it will. And if you haven't got a list that can handle that, it's going to be that proper, complete opposite list that hits the table and goes, I'm sorry, you weren't ready for this, so I beat you.
Yeah.
There might be 200 offset bodies on the board against you, and you might pick, the thing to give you 15 points for killing that many bodies. But again, they score all their secondaries and all their primaries, as we talked about earlier.
Yeah,
win the game, and they've done that in loads of ways. One, the coherency, which is a really clever change. Two, blast weapons, and then three, the negatives to hit.
Yep.
So I think Hordes have had lots and lots of hits to stop them being as dominant. So you can't just string all your buffs off one guy at the back.
And like you say as well, though, coming to a smaller board, they've just become much more efficient. I had to do the coherence thing because you'd never be able to get on the board.
Well, I almost thought they were going to go to the AOS style 1-inch coherency. And some people thought they might, the rumors about that's definitely coming in. They haven't. And I think it works fine. But I really thought they might, just depending on, again, how your hordes and things go. But pushing the points up of these basic troops you can spam in big numbers means that's probably limiting it. Yeah. I mean, there's nothing to say you won't just take 200 guardsmen and stick them on the board in 20s and go, cool, you've got some blast weapons. Don't really care.
Yeah.
Run.
I have so many wounds that you just keep trying to get through.
Because that's the danger, I suppose, with some lists. If you give them a really cheap troop and you give them really good options behind, or, again, you could take that list with your guard and make them basically fearless and then put a load of Space Marine stuff behind it.
Yeah.
There's some great options in there. So, 200 guardsmen run at you whilst 9 eradicators outflank and kill your tanks, and smash captains run in between going, haha, you can't target me. There's going to be some dirty 9th lists that come out, just like there were dirty 8th lists. Dirty 7th lists. That is...
At the end of the day, competitive players will find ways to bring something that no one's thought of, that you turn up and you're like, oh, I don't know how I'm going to deal with this because I just didn't see this. I didn't see someone bringing that, whatever it is, I've seen a lot of talk about Nurgling bases and
that's an army to be ready for. I mean, if you don't get a 4-wound model with a 5+ invuln and 5+ fear depending against damage 1 at 18 points a base, it's good. When somebody puts 60 of them down on the table against you, you're going to get it because they're deploying 9 inches away, and just like we said, they're charging and they're tagging stuff and they do not care.
Yeah, you can kill them. Doesn't matter. I've got loads more where they come.
Yeah, that's it. So, but then I've already seen people beating that list and bringing things to counter it. Like your White Scars, for example, are a really good army that in all phases of the game can go, cool, I can really damage Nurgling bases at toughness 2. My 2 damage assault weapons by turn 3 mean I can rinse through you late turns. So there are hard counters, but you just got to have that in mind when you're planning your list. So
no, it's really, really good. And I mean, I say I love the changes to 9th edition. Not absolutely everything, but you're never going to love everything. Let's face it, there's always going to be things.
No, and like we talked earlier about why Games Workshop prices some things and where it balances things. And they are a miniatures company. They are bringing out this thing that they want you to buy and they want it to sell, and they go on to the next thing that they want you to buy and they want to sell. So you can never 100% balance a game like this. I don't think it's like there's now, was it 9th Ed Fantasy that some people still play that Games Workshop doesn't really support anymore, but there's a whole dedicated core group of fans they've balanced it, they've tweaked it. That is as balanced as possible now. We're never going to get out of 40k because it's always about bringing out the new cool thing. The squat army is going to roll out and all the squat trikes are going to be stupidly priced and exosuits are going to be 10 points. And, do you know what I mean? That's just how they sell models.
Exactly. And also, if you've got a living game with rules that are constantly changing, well, as soon as you change one rule, like we were saying earlier, with stuff becoming not as good, with stuff becomes better. And, and I suppose, again, that is also how because they do some of these things to sell models, which, I don't care as long as they keep making the game good.
Well, we keep buying the models, dude, so exactly. We can't complain.
I mean, I'm so deep in now, there's no getting out, So everyone's like, there's a price hike on all these old models. I'm like, whatever. We're still going to buy them, so it doesn't matter. But thanks very much for coming on and talking. and hopefully get you on again soon. We'll talk hopefully a bit more about once we know. Well, once there's some more tournaments, really. I mean, there's only some small ones going on, but unfortunately we couldn't. I was hoping to see you again at the LGT this year.
Yeah, well, do you know what? If your one down in Essex had fallen on a different day, I would have tried to make it down to that. But it's hard with current travel and my wife working as well, so it's not make it to that one. But
and you've got a fairly newborn, haven't you, as well?
So. Oh no, she's nearly 3 now. We're pretty deep in, so no.
Oh, yeah, but still though. Still a toddler.
Oh, definitely requires more time.
Yeah. Well, we'll leave it there, and I hope you guys enjoyed listening to Tony and what he had to say on 9th edition, and we will see you in the next one. Thanks. Bye.